So I'm going to introduce our panelists. They all want to just be panelists, and they are going to talk in turn. First, we will have Andrea Basche from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Jordan Trickle from the National Family Farm Coalition, and I would point out that there was a misprint in the program. It's National Family Farm Coalition. Michael Hupp from the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy, Claire Lamine from INRAE in France, and Johnny Bear Cub Stiff Arm, who is a citizen of the Fort Peck Assiniboine. I didn't say that right. Can I say that right again? Assiniboine. Thank you. I'm so sorry because I was trying hard. And the Sioux tribes, Assiniboine and Sioux tribes at Fort Peck. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrea. No, Colin will be up here and tell you the rest of the afternoon stuff later.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you all again for what has been a really stimulating few days of discussion. And, I want to try to cover some ground that has not already been covered. What can I say that has not been said? But I'll maybe say some similar things, some new things in a slightly different way for this panel with respect to barriers and policy. So I thought I might start by telling you a little bit about myself that goes beyond my resume, and I'll fill some things in along the way. So I am the daughter of Ken Basche, that's how my name is pronounced, and Maria Novacek. So my dad's family are white European settlers from Eastern Europe of the Jewish faith. My mother's family is from various parts of Eastern Europe of importance to food and culture. Her family was Italian. I grew up in Atlantic County, New Jersey, so I'm not from a farm. That is kind of important in my story of how I do or do not feel like I often fit into various spaces here. My mom is a retired dietitian who always insisted that we eat dinner together. She also would insist that you never leave her table hungry, or even a little bit, or always full. So thinking about feeding people, food is nourishment, food is community. It's very important to me. And I grew up around a lot of women who were, and family who would just stand up if they saw something that didn't look right. And so a lot of fierce women in my line. I guess I should say my dad was a public school teacher for 30 plus years and he never wasted food. So there's a lot of themes here, growing up near the ocean, beautiful public beaches in the Pinelands, and in a mixed religious family. It never seemed odd to me to have a menorah, a Christmas tree, to celebrate Seder. I only live 20 minutes off of I-80, so please come visit us, especially if it is near to Passover time. It's my favorite holiday to celebrate. And so I share all those things with you because it's a part of my why. And this Jewish heritage, this never understanding anti-Semitism in the world, this Jesuit education that I had for my undergraduate, that spirit of social justice, having, again, the ocean in my soul, a wonder of the natural world, that all inspired this spirit and ethic in me that fuels the work I do today. So now I work at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I'm in the agronomy and horticulture department. I study diversified cropping systems, trained in agronomy from Iowa State University. I teach undergraduates. Again, I want to express who I am because, frankly, I have had a very privileged upbringing. I'm white, I'm straight, I'm in a biophysical department. I am at a very well-resourced land-grant university. So I can bring what I can bring to this space, and I hope that I can inspire a little bit more of something for everyone, but really looking at some of the early career folks who are here thinking about their futures. So I want to start with some of the things that I see as barriers to agroecological research in universities. So many of them we have already discussed. One that I want to underscore really is time, but I think that everything that we have talked about is really rooted in, frankly, the white supremacy culture that permeates academia, the focus on quantity over quality, amongst other harmful workplace cultures. So time, right? Time is limited. It's one of our most precious resources. And of course, as we've all commented on, it takes time to build the relationships and trust for transformative, non-extractive research. And, just a note to say that I've been a part of the organizing group, and in spite of our team's many meetings for a long period of time, we recognize that our process and planning could have been better in some ways. And so, I truly feel, and I would love to talk more about time management. I've already been talking with many of you about this, but I do feel that the root of a lot of evil at the universities is overcommitment. That's what I see students getting neglected. I see relationships get neglected because we are frankly overcommitted, and I know that I'm a part of the problem in that too. I would say with respect to barriers at universities, I think supportive mentorship is really important. We're told to be collaborative, as has already been shared. I appreciated Tim's comments about letting go of our egos. We're told to be collaborative, but we're really not incentivized to do that or really to support our students and our colleagues. It's not trivial in our roles to juggle all of the things that we have to juggle, and I admire so many of you here who are further in your careers who've been able to do that, but I can see what a hustle and how much juggling it takes, and sometimes I frankly feel tired. I'm at a juncture. I've just been granted tenure. It's not official because it is official, but not official until August. I just share that as the juncture I'm at in my career. But I feel like I really have had to conform in some ways to what I think is expected, and I can pivot now to other things. But pivoting when you already have a full plate is not an easy task either, and I assume that folks in other institutions can relate to that too. When we all have a ship going in one direction, to steer it differently is difficult, but I remain determined to continue to pivot more of my work because that's guided by my values, my sense of, frankly, responsibility and privilege for where I am to contribute to a more equitable food system. I do want to just note a personal anecdote here, which is that I almost didn't apply for my job. I applied like the last day, because it just looked so typical. It just looked like we want a typical agronomist, and that was really not what my background was. And it turns out that that's what people were looking for. It turns out I've been pretty well supported. And so I guess the story in that is just to say that you don't know until you apply and try. But I also do want to share that I really didn't have, as a graduate student, I had some great role models, but no people who I felt looked like me who were doing their job authentically and supporting community and doing equitable research. I just didn't have that, and I'm glad to have more people here in this room. So I guess if you're a bright young person and thinking about your future, there can be a role for you in the academy, but I'm not here to try to sell you on that. In fact, I might deter you on it. But it's just to say that it can be done if you really stay true to your values and you find support in leadership. And you might be willing to work really hard, but those might not be things that you find or are willing to do. So that is what I wanted to say about that. So already noting things about barriers at the academy, right? That it's time, it's mentorship. Another element of this is trying to build culturally competent colleagues, right? So do I have a community of folks around me who can do the work? And I'm not saying that I am perfect. I know that I'm not. But I have really lived in collaborative projects for a lot of time. I could say more to the folks directly with the USDA about large grants, coordinated agriculture project grants. I was a part of one as a graduate student. I'm a part of two now, and one that is just starting. These are tens of millions of dollars of awards that USDA gives out. I think some of it can be channeled for good, but I also think that there are a lot of issues with them. I'll say more about it in a minute, but it was brought up by one of our tables that we need to get our houses in order first. And so I think with respect to bringing colleagues up to speed and having enough of a community around us to do the work is really important. So CAP grants are flawed. These big multi-million-dollar grants are flawed. How could they be improved to stimulate more agroecology? As a graduate student cohort back in 2014 on a coordinated agriculture project, we wrote about some of the skills that we thought would be really important for generating kind of this cohort of individuals that could support truly collaborative research. And so some of those skills included leadership, it included facilitation, included communication. I was looking back at that, getting ready, going, oh yeah, like we've thought about this. Like there's lots of other people who've written about this, that this is a different skill set and it, takes a cohort, right? And often these CAP grants are, I would frankly argue, very white supremacist in the way we can all probably relate to this with our grants, that they give us not enough money and ask us to do way too much. And so, and they're often driven by the biophysical research. So I think there are some real tangible things that could be shifted in some of these awards to lead to more of the outcomes that we would like to see. I know, and just underscore the point, I'm still coming from a very privileged place with respect to funding and these things, but it's still not always enough to do the things that we want to do. So I conclude, that's a little bit about my thoughts on in the experiencing the academy, but with respect to other barriers. So I wrote about it in my statement, but I worked on a publication that was led by Marcia DeLange, who's with us in spirit, and other colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So we worked on a survey of sustainable agriculture scientists with respect to barriers. And this was motivated in part by the exceptional analysis that Marcia had led with Liz Carlisle and Albie Miles, who found in 2015, he did a big analysis of competitive grants, and that a very infinitesimal amount of it is going to more ecological research. But I knew from my experience as a graduate student at Iowa State that the barriers are much greater than just the funding, right? That it is about these workplace cultures. It is about politics. So this was motivated by my seeing a number of political incidents there that were just really unjust, that undermine student activism or critique of mainstream production agriculture in any way. So from that survey, what we found was there was the most agreement from scientists about a question related to one of the largest barriers being entrenched financial interests. A smaller percentage of people, between 11 and 13%, said that they either had direct political interference with their work or were discouraged from publishing their work. And so this might be a barrier for some. It may not be a barrier for all, but I just find this interesting kind of in the mix of all the things we've talked about, how much this has to do with mentorship, seeing successful role models. Early career folks also said that they saw less career stability. So there were some interesting things from that survey, actually that mirrored the survey that we did in anticipation of this workshop. Okay, what else do I want to share and wrap up? That within the broader public funding sphere, there aren't these new dollars coming online, right? Climate Smart has been brought up. And when you dig into what USDA defines as climate smart, there's a lot of the practices that we're talking about that we might say are ecologically based, right? But we know that that is not necessarily how this funding is playing out in practice. And so I do think that there really could be an incredible opportunity to channel some of this money into more ecological work. But of course that requires courage on behalf of the folks who are leading it, and maybe some attention raising to make sure decision makers are using those dollars to channel the greatest good. Okay, so I do think that, and just in wrapping up, that funding agencies could have a role to play in shifting some of these cultures, holding universities and others, organizations accountable to the process and change and doing the work in the way that we know is going to be the most transformative. And I do believe that there are some funding initiatives in place that we could channel for greater good. Yes, and that is mostly what I want to say, but I do want to wrap up by saying when I think about the things I've done in my life that I'm the most proud of, they're the ones that have been the hardest. And so I appreciate being here, doing really hard work with all of you, because I hope we will feel, and know we will feel proud of it when we leave it in the future. So thank you.
Well, greeting, folks. My name is Jordan Treacle. I work for the National Family Farm Coalition. We are a farmer member-based advocacy organization with 33 member groups representing family farmers, ranchers, fisher folk, peasants across the country. We're based in traditional Anacostan territory, or Washington, D.C., and have been around since 1986 doing this policy work. So when I talk about who I'm trying to bring into this room and who I'm accountable in this work, it's those farmers that make up our organization, including our Missouri-based member group, Missouri Rural Crisis Center. They've been challenging corporate power and saving family farms since 1985. They've got some great cooperatively sourced pork as well, so check them out and support their work. So we have a really diverse membership, and the thing that really binds our membership together is our political orientation to our advocacy. We do primarily national and international policy advocacy. We're deeply embedded in farmer and peasant networks and social movements globally. We don't accept USDA or any government funding so that we can have our independence and our advocacy of speaking truth to power. And advancing food sovereignty is really core to our organizational identity and mission. So I wanted to take a couple of minutes here to emphasize two main points on governance. And these points have come up in different pockets and spaces of the last couple of days, but I think they're really important as we start to conclude this last full day and talk about policy to really uplift and emphasize. So the first is, we've talked about how agroecology research must challenge power asymmetries. And you all know that knowledge is political, and the roots of agroecology have been challenging hegemonic forces from the beginning. And I think that, as a non-academic, that challenging power asymmetries should have at least two dimensions. One is challenging the power asymmetries between the academy and rural communities. So we've talked about how, fundamentally shifting whose knowledge is valued and who deserves to know. That was mentioned in the last couple of days. But also, this research has to challenge the broader asymmetries of power within our food system, so antagonizing the status quo systems of oppression, extraction, and inequities. And part of this work at a broader sort of food system scale is being deeply in alignment with the social movements that are currently advancing agroecology and food sovereignty as a political project. The second point I want to emphasize is this question of what is the role of public food and agriculture institutions like USDA in this work, and how do we as civil society and social movements engage there? So NFFC, as many of you as well, have been fighting for nearly 4 decades to challenge and reform our public institutions because we believe that we can't afford to cede those political spaces. These are institutions that have and continue to do enormous harm in our communities. And they're also spaces that would be causing a lot more harm if we were not collectively doing this work to try to reform them. So I also want to be clear here that we have friends within these institutions, and many of them come from our movements, and they're doing critical work of reforming these institutions, inside the building. And many of our farmers in our network are receiving essential funding and services from USDA that help our rural communities survive. So these government institutions are not monoliths, but their holistic impact of places like USDA in the US continues to be deeply skewed towards agribusiness interests. And there's a deep mistrust amongst our communities and the department. So I think it's also really important to remember that while this conference is titled Focusing Around Agroecology in the U.S., agroecology and food sovereignty movements are built across territories. And we have to recognize that while there have been some policy gains made within USDA, particularly in the last few years, just as an example, the Equity Commission at USDA is a good thing. But those gains do not extend beyond the mainland U.S. So in terms of international policy, and here I'm including the experience of folks in the U.S. territories, USDA together with USAID and the Department of State are deeply invested in the Imperialist project. We have been fighting for years to prevent USDA from blocking agroecology frameworks, human rights frameworks like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants at the United Nations. And that is just a defensive tactic. That's just trying to reduce harm. USDA has been propping up agribusiness interests in the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa for years. USDA has been attacking seed policies in Mexico and dairy supply management in Canada in the last month and the last decades. The list is really long. So much of our farmer membership, and really the message that I was asked to bring to this space, is that our members feel that agroecology, whether it's a research agenda or a more tangible policy framework, cannot be entrusted to USDA as an institution as it exists today. And I think that there's power in spaces like these in articulating, using research tools and academic perspectives on the how and why USDA is actively undermining agroecology, and how agroecology should be grounded in rural communities and those community-based collective action institutions that were mentioned yesterday. I think that we have to both hold the political spaces and continue the policy work that we're doing right now in the current system, and that's a defensive tactic for survival, while also growing our vision for an agroecology future in our own autonomous organizing spaces that are really centering rural communities and social movements. So I want to start to wrap up here by just offering a few thoughts on the policy debate that are sort of intertwined in agroecology in different ways, particularly as it relates to USDA. So USDA is very open and public about the fact that they will not privilege one scale of agriculture over another when interacting in multilateral policy spaces. And we've seen this over and over again, in negotiating with governments at the UN. So if we can't have an honest conversation about scale with USDA, what are the implications of that for agroecology in terms of public policy? An Office of Small Farms has been proposed in the past. It's also been re-proposed in this Farm Bill. We don't have that yet. That's also not the solution to this problem, but I think we need to really have an honest reflection on what that means, to not be able to talk about scale. A second point, farmers who are not employees of the U.S. government cannot hold administrative power in USDA. So legally, if there's no independent farmer, peasant, indigenous, community-based accountability mechanism in USDA that has real political power, we're relegated to advisory committees, which are problematic in their own ways. What does that mean when we talk about participatory governance in public institutions? And then the last point here is just, again, raising up the fact that there's a lack of policy coherence between how USDA shows up in domestic policy and international policy spaces. So what does that mean for building the global agroecology movement and doing translocal research on agroecology? Since I have the floor, I'm going to take one extra minute, because I'm not at 10 minutes yet, to say that there's a couple examples where I think social movement and academic collaboration is really working well to inform policy work. And I really want to applaud that. And I also want to recognize those of you who are in academic institutions, the political power that you have that is not about research. So I mentioned earlier that agroecology needs to challenge power asymmetries in these two dimensions. And for part of our work at the United Nations, we co-coordinate an autonomous civil society organizing space in which social movements and indigenous voices are centered. And we develop policy positions by consensus and then negotiate directly with governments. And particularly in the last couple of years, when we saw this UN Food Systems Summit that was really captured by corporate interest from the beginning, we were able to engage with a group of activists, scholars, and researchers who created their own organizing space to do research. So they were not actually welcomed into the space where social movements were for our own autonomous space. They created their own separate thing, but they made themselves available to do really critical research and analysis that helped inform our policy advocacy in the UN. I think that's a really inspiring model. It was a short-term thing, but I think there's a lot of things that like the folks at ARC are doing that have elements of that. The second thing, and I've heard the alarm, so I'm going to wrap up, is that we have been working for more than 15 years on a campaign that's pushing back against U.S. pension funds grabbing land in the U.S. as well as in the northeast of Brazil and other parts of the world. And through that work, we've uncovered the ways in which academic faculties are having your hard-earned pension funds invested in farmland. And most of the academic folks that we talk about this phenomenon don't know it. So I'm willing to bet my very expensive plane ticket back to DC that either you or someone you know in your network is having your pension fund invested in land, and that's displacing people in the U.S. and other parts of the world. And we've been really glad to be really well received when we try to do this political education with academics and supporting academics in doing organizing in your institutions and passing Senate faculty resolutions for divestment from speculative land investment. And we've got more than 20 of these resolutions passed at different institutions as well as some unions. And so if that is something that you're interested in talking about and making sure that your pension is not invested in displacing heirs property owners in the Mississippi Delta or local communities in the northeast of Brazil, or being used to grab water rights right by Steve Glissman's farm, which is another phenomenon, I'd be happy to talk to you all after the panel. Thanks so much.
That was great, Jordan. Hi, folks. My name is Michael Happ. I am the Program Associate for Climate and Rural Communities at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, or IATP, based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Some of you may know my colleague, Shiny Varghese. I just want to sit up here and thank her for her mentorship and her leadership in agroecology for a couple decades now. Some of you may know her, and she was instrumental in getting water declared as a human right by the UN. So IATP, we're a think tank that tries to focus on agroecological issues. We were started in the 1980s in the midst of the farm crisis, and we really wanted to start out as an organization that did local, regional, national, and international work, right? Making these connections between the farm crisis that was driving lots of people off the land here in the United States and similar things happening in other parts of the world. So I want to have my talk kind of build off of what Jordan was saying and also what Garrett was saying in the earlier talk. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the Farm Bill and how it has been a force for a lot of the things that we're opposed to here in this room, and ways that we can maybe try and fight back and use those tools for the crumbs that we do get, and also long-term try and steer it in a direction, in a more agroecological direction, if that's even possible. So I want to draw your attention to this pie chart. We've been talking a lot about pies this week. This is thanks to the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. So this is kind of a breakdown of the Farm Bill, where the funding goes. For those of you who know the ins and outs of the Farm Bill, I apologize in advance, but for those of you who don't, it's every 5-year giant piece of legislation that funds, everything from nutrition programs. About 75%, 76% of the bill goes toward nutrition. A lot of it also goes toward crop insurance, right? This program that says that it cares about risk, but really benefits the types of agriculture that don't take into account risk, right? Don't take into account climate crisis as a risk, right? you won't be eligible for crop insurance unless you're trying to maximize your yields, right? If you're not trying to maximize your yields and make the most money possible, according to crop insurance, that's risky. And meanwhile, a lot of the people in this room who grow food are growing it for a completely different reason. So that's one thing that we'd like to change. And one thing that I do most of my work on is the wedge of the pie on conservation, right? I focus on a couple of programs, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. And these are programs that are meant to help farmers pay for conservation practices on their land. But in too many cases is going to things that worsen the environmental crisis. With EQIP in particular, a lot of that money is going toward factory farms. A lot of it is going toward irrigation. A lot of it going toward things that make the climate crisis worse and are destroying the land as we know it. And then I'll draw your attention to the very, very tiny black wedge of the pie that has just about everything else, including the research title. And we know that even within the research title, not a lot of money, even less of it goes toward agroecological research. So that's a pretty daunting pie. There's a lot of money that's not going toward the things that we care about. And one thing I want to just make sure that I do before I get off the stage is share resources with you all in case you want to try and change that in whatever ways that we can. So if you want to take a picture of the link up there, you can. That is a link to a spreadsheet with all the different members of Congress and their staffers that work on agriculture. I'll just have you know, a lot of industrial ag actors, a lot of trade groups are in these offices at least once a week, dropping off their Cheez-Its and, talking to them about crop insurance, talking to them about the things that keep in place the industrial model. And I encourage those of you who have energy and time to take a look at these emails, take a look at these phone numbers, and send a message. Offer to educate these 24-year-old staffers on what agroecology is, right? I know a lot of you probably aren't allowed to directly lobby, so if this is on your personal time, go ahead and talk to them about what agroecology is and why it's important to you. And meanwhile, we're still building the movement outside of the halls of power. There's a lot more that I want to say, but I'm just going to leave it at that and hand the microphone to Claire.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. First of all, I want to say that I'm very happy and even touched to be here with some colleagues who influenced my first steps into agroecological transition, such as Steve, and with colleagues I met more recently, like Colin, Ernesto, and many others, and to meet all these new friends and people from farmers' networks, local communities, and so on. So I'm French, as you can guess from my accent. I'm from a rural background. I've worked for quite a few years in rural development and then held a restaurant before I decided to go back to the university again in my early 30s and then enter academia. I now work at the INRAE, which is the National Public Institute for Agricultural, Food and Environmental Research now. And I mainly work, I would say, either in very place-based action research approaches, projects, or on the other hand, into national or transnational intersectoral networks and what you may call communities of practice. And the 4 points I wanted to make are here. So and they're going to be based on my experience mainly in France and Brazil, where I have to work a lot. So you can switch, please. So the first point is I wanted to say a few words about the effects and the limits of the devoted agroecological policies that were set up both in Brazil and France in the last 20 years, let's say. So as you may know, Brazil first, in the early 2000s, France in 2012 have launched agroecological policies at the national scale that I would say allowed, and I will give a few examples, some significant changes, especially by supporting collective farmers' dynamics and innovations and changes in practices. And I'll talk a bit later on the Ecoforte program in Brazil and the collective mobilization for agroecology program in France. They've also helped structuring new markets and outlets, especially through public programs and regulations linked to public food procurement in both countries, but Brazil is particularly innovative in that. The Brazilian case is very interesting in its participatory governance system, to echo what Jonathan was saying, in that this agroecological policy is or was or is again, you know, there's been a strong policy dismantling, of course, during 4 years, but is like monitored by diverse commissions at all levels, federal, state, municipal, that are composed of half institutional government people and half civil society, farmers movement or civil society movements, which is a really strong thing. Of course, in both countries, these policies were quite imperfect. They are even weak in front of industrial agriculture. In France, the pesticide use, for example, has not diminished. It has even risen a bit after these years. And there are some processes of cooptation of agroecology in both countries. In France, it would be by a technocratic or corporate agroecology. And in Brazil, we've had this policy dismantling after 2016. But still, and especially in Brazil, they led to the creation and to the reinforcement over time of lasting alliances across the academic, the farming, and the civil society world, of which ANA, the National Articulation for Agroecology in Brazil, which is a multi-actor coalition, is a good example. And this also supported some dynamics to carry on during the Bolsonaro era. And then this figure about comes from a recent perspective that was carried out in my institution with other European colleagues about future Europe with pesticide-free agriculture. And it's just to say that in some places, I was surprised. I accepted to take part to this, but thinking, well, I'm going to be like always with people who are going to find technological solutions and so on. And we could defend a scenario. So there was a global market scenario. There was a healthy microbiome, very much biology-based scenario, but we could defend an embedded landscape and territorial food system scenario in such a... So it's just to be a bit hopeful about our potential role in policies. Can you switch? The second point is the idea that I think is important and that came out of diverse experiences that we had in especially in France and Brazil and other countries, that agroecological transitions have to be recognized as open-ended processes. For example, I was talking about these two policy schemes that are they're not comparable, but they have common points. The collective mobilization and the eco-fortier schemes in France and Brazil. Both were intended to support collective farmers' dynamics, and they shared common points, which are that the target is not individual farmers but groups, and they favor multi-actors group, also with civil society, consumers, market actors. They both are based on a territorial approach, so these groups have to have a territorial anchorage and approach. And what we found interesting in the analysis that we carried out with Brazilian colleagues and partners, practitioners of these networks as well, is that they allowed these groups to build their own trajectory of change. Of course, there are some determinist criteria, like they have to have indicators to get the funding. But the way the calls were drafted, and of course some civil society actors and researchers took part also to the writing of the calls, was that there would be a large flexibility for actors to build their trajectory. And based on these kinds of analysis, but also other ones on other issues such as agronomic experimentation, genetic innovation, territorial food systems, and teaching. Teaching is a big thing. Like in France, for example, the agroecological reform has led to a complete reform of the agricultural teaching, which is going to take years because it's like a big boat. It goes very slowly. But for the next generation of farmers, I think it's going to play a role. So over all these issues with a bunch of colleagues from other countries as well, we built this collection of articles about this idea of agroecological transitions as open-ended or as mixing some deterministic and open-ended views. The third point is about if you can switch to the next one, please. Is about the need for transdisciplinary research and for place-based, embedded, and lasting transdisciplinary approaches for territorial agroecological transitions. My local experience here is that having lived in a rural area called Ardèche in the southeast France for nearly 20 years, I decided with some civil society, farmers networks, and local authorities, we were 5 conveners, to set up an action research project that we call L'assiette et le territoire, the plate and the territory, which we organized around a group of around 25 local actors and researchers, mainly actors, with a very strong principle that was that people had to commit themselves to take part to it and for themselves, and that among these people there had to be not only people representing organizations, but also coming because they were concerned actors and they were not necessarily representing any organization, farmers, citizens, shopkeepers, or whatever, whoever. And these groups started to co-define research questions around what are important issues to explore. For example, new entrants, land access, food democracy, and so on. We worked because we found it was an important first step on a shared analysis and interpretation discussion of the territorial food system's past trajectory over the last decades and even on a longer time span, and the changes in power relationships that occurred in food systems, across the food systems over these decades. We wrote a manifesto that was communicated to local policymakers and so on. And we also carried out a kind of exploratory exercise of we called it like socio-ecological literacy, but it very much echoes what some of you were saying about our relationship, our sensitive and emotional relationship to non-humans in our territory. And this was an important exercise within the group to also work on more like concrete or pragmatic things. And later on, we transformed it into a local food council, which it is now. We open a call for new people, so we have some new people, but it's an autonomous local food council whose aim is to act as an arena of exchange across local initiatives, but also across local policies in a context where, I forgot to say that within this French agroecological policy, a specific, another important instrument that has been set up is that of territorial food projects. So this is funding for small regions to define their territorial strategies. But often this is like done by or led by with certain visions that are those of the political leaders of these small regions. So our local councils in our small region, for example, plays a role as a kind of watchdog role in relations of key issues of food justice, food democracy, and so on in relation to these projects. And the last point, and we also organized local forums, so it became yearly, it's every year, which brings like 100 people together from the territory, cooking, workshops and other activities where we concretely share our attachment to food and the territory. And my last point is about how based on this Brazilian and French and other countries' experience, how can you can go? Yeah, thank you. How can agroecological research programs favor co-led research led by researchers and practitioners, social movements together? And as I say, this very place-based local project that we carried out and still carry out in Ardèche is convened by 5 organizations. So there are 2 local, one farmers movement, one environmental and food education coalition, and 2 local institutions, authorities. And then at a larger scale, but partly based on this experience and our partners' experience, we set up the ATER project, whom some of you are part of. So it's a European project, financially speaking, but it includes Brazilian and US partners, as well as French, British, and Italian ones. And it's half academic partners and half non-academics. And it's based on a shared portfolio of case studies, of 16 case studies across these countries, and the idea of like cross-fertilization, knowledge exchange across these case studies and experiences. And I just wanted to say a word of this because this was possible because European research programs allow, and even for some programs, favor such co-led projects, which I think are powerful to support transdisciplinary knowledge co-creation, depending what we make of them, of course, and transnational networks or community of practices, where I think we try to like develop the idea of an experience-based approach in contrast to a purely evidence-based one, and also echoing what some of you were saying, switch from like nurturing egos to building collective subjectivities. That's what we tried. Thank you for your attention. And I hand
Halmidag yabi, nakon iwa akt, hungawa shterwi yamitawa, hudeshana je macha, washini yabi Johnny Bearcub Stiffarm. I was raised by my grandparents in a very traditional Nakota family. And as I got older, my grandfather told me, if you ever want anyone to really listen to you out there and to hear you speak from your heart, you let them know what your real name is, and you tell them where you're from. My real name is Hungawashtewia, which means good chief woman when you translate it out. I am from the Haudenosaunee clan, which is the Red Bottom clan, of the Nakota Nation, which the English people call Assiniboine. That's who I am. We all have been here now for several days, listening to panels, having discussions at our tables, kicking around ideas, and everybody talking. Why did I come? Well, number one, I came precisely to find out who gave my name. But the other reason why I decided to come was because I know what qualitative data and quantitative data can do for you. I know how you can take that information and leverage it to get money to finally get done what needs to be done for your projects. So I came to learn more about that. I only met one person at the airport who talked to me about data. And he is now my friend, whether he likes it or not. But I didn't get that. Instead, I got something else. And so it brings me back to my one-page paper that I hope you guys will all go in there and read those one-page papers. Some of them are very dry. Some of them are also very interesting and hold promise. Mine is kind of different. So when I was asked to write this one-page paper, I thought to myself, what in the hell is agroecology? And so I Googled it and I read a bunch of different things. So when I wrote this paper, I didn't know anything about who you are, what you're doing, and why we were coming to this conference. But I was hoping I would find something that would help me. And that's still a question that's in my mind, as I know it is in several people's minds out in that audience. Everybody knows that climate change is going to impact everyone. The new words of food resiliency, talking about power with food and all of this. It's the same old story for our communities, it just has different words. But it now has more impact. It has more of an urgency. We don't have time anymore in our communities. That time is up. We can't talk about 7 generations because we don't know if 7 generations, the 7th generation from now is going to even be alive or existing, depending upon where our people live on this planet as climate change occurs. So 50 years from now, it's not going to be, food security is not just going to be for humans, it's going to be for all living life on our planet. 100 years from now, it's going to be very changed from what we have today. The bounty we have at our buffets and at our meals that we eat here, that is not what it's going to look like 150 years from now. So what will our families think about us then? Well, in looking at agroecology, I figured, well, it's an academic thing. They study us. They document us. Well, that's fine and that's good enough for a little while. But if they want and are inviting us to the table today, then that tells me that I need to tell agroecology that they cannot document things that are changing over time. They've got to suck it in and they got to be willing to join us in the fight. They have to become an actively participating partner that is willing to join a team that changes the way humans interact with nature as we herd animals and we plant the earth. That's what has to happen. So if you look at these traditional models of research and analysis and the focus on publication, that doesn't work anymore. Because what has that done is it has flawed the perceptions of both the institutions and the researchers. I have looked at research proposals because I'm on my tribal IRB board, and I have helped to construct something that we're going to be implementing next month across 4 tribal community colleges and 4 tribal buffalo ranges, and it's going to be a 4-year project, which I hope we'll be able to continue to find money for it to go further and beyond, because this is just laying down the baseline. But what we have found, and what I have found, is that the most successful research projects out there depend upon a collaboration. Successful research in diverse communities, tribal communities, communities of color, advocating groups that believe with all their heart in what they're willing to die for as they advocate for it. Within all of those groups that you desperately need and want to research, that successful research comes from having a team, and that team must be made up of not only the researched individuals, because when you're researching a practice or something, you're researching the individual who is doing that practice, because that practice would not have occurred without that individual being a part of it. You are looking at talking to community activists, because that individual who is planting or changing or hurting or doing something different would not have been able to do it without the support and the prayers and the help of a community activist. You need to have those NGOs there beside you because they have money and we need money. We're communities that don't have that money. So we need an NGO or somebody there with a flexible pocketbook. And we need private industry. Private industry needs to be at that table. I am one of 5 owners of an employee-owned carbon offset company. And one of the things that we do when we look at that is we have morals in our company. And so we are really particular about what we do with our projects that we have for carbon offsets in the communities that they're based in. And so you want private industry there who is impacted by your community or is dependent on your community in one way or the other, and that actually cares about your community. So private industry needs to be at that table when you're getting ready to do this research on projects. The other thing that needs to be there is you have to have colleges and universities. Colleges and universities are critically important, or private research institutions that have a good name. Because in order to be recognized in today's society, and no matter how much we talk about what we wish for out there, we have to be realistic in the society that we exist in. So you need a good name. Once you get your team together, what do you want to do? Well, I thought about agroecology, and I thought, well, it could be a factor. It could be a factor in stimulating creativity for new models of agriculture and ranching. You know, what do we do? Well, we're taking ancient techniques. We're expanding the use of heirloom seeds. We're doing regenerative grazing of ruminant herds, bison, cattle, goats. And what's happening now is because everyone's paying attention to our so-called ancient ways of doing things, is that they are also changing it around to combine it with modern, futuristic methods. Today we have new technologies that can help us that we are now beginning to implement. All of these results and everything as you create a project need to be validated. They need to be validated through research, specifically and with the help of agroecology research. This where research in turn turns around and tells the world that this new model that's a combination of ancient and modern is valid. It is credible. It is important to pay attention to, because this new model can help make the world a better place, and it could contribute to the survival of not only the human race, but everything else that surrounds us on this planet. And 50 years from now, I can guarantee you they're going to be talking that way, because they're going to finally recognize that things are changing so quickly and so fast and they have no control. So that is critically important. So they can help us to validate that. And once it's validated, It can encourage capacity building. It can encourage investments from public-private partnerships, especially those that are accessible to organizations that provide technical assistance or provide food systems such as not-for-profits. All of that can be put into play. So what agroecologists could do is they can join us at the table to be a catalyst for change. And they have to be willing to be brave enough to be willing to do that. But that's not good enough, though. It's just not good enough. Because I tell you, in today's society, whatever we do is tied to that dollar. So you have to have financial incentives, because financial incentives are key to changing generational patterns and that can encourage the adoption of climate resiliency changes. Why is this rancher in Montana going to join Natives Regenerative Grazing Project? You don't get paid for that carbon that's in the ground. You're going to be paid for the things you do from your baseline up here, and you're going to make money from that. And if you make money from that, you can keep your ranch and your family. Your children who are college educated understand that carbon is going to be a part of their lives forever. They're going to want to improve on that. They're going to keep doing that. And if you can get paid for it and you can use that money to make improvements, you bet we're going to participate in it. So you have to have those financial incentives in place to make sure that those generational behaviors that ruin the earth and ruin the soils and that can be changed to better behaviors and things that are going to make improved soil, improved water, improved plant biodiversity, and improved life. Because if you don't have those financial incentives in place, it's just not going to work. So financial incentives can encourage the adoption of climate resiliency changes. It doesn't only have to be from the payment from private industry. It can be from grants. It can be from foundations. You can package that money any way you want. It's still money. So you have to figure out, how do we do that to make these changes? So you have to talk about the economics. The other thing I think is critically important is that, when you look at these and you want to sustain these changes, you need to make sure that they are not just beneficial, but they are also complementary, they are inclusive, they are created by and in tandem with the community where the research and application takes place. You need to be consistently and collaboratively accelerating climate action and ensuring those actions can create clarity and incentives for the producers and the organizers who are making the change to that landscape. So everything that has been talked about within the last couple of days and every panel that has been here and all of these educators who have come willing to take the risk to share their knowledge with those of us in the audience that they don't know, that they're scared we're going to beat up on them, need to take a breath and know that some of us are willing to make those teams and partnerships. I have a diagram here that a good friend of mine, Jason Valdez, worked on. And I work with buffalo in my volunteer time. That's my passion. And we were talking about doing the research on buffalo because we need to establish our baseline. I'm not sharing this with all of you because it is still a draft and he is still working on it. But he has a science background. He's a member of the tribes, the Arapaho and Shoshone tribes in Wyoming, and he works with their buffalo herds there. But on one side, you have Western science. And he got comments from a bunch of us that put ideas what we think Western science is. We said the mathematical models, the micro and macro theories, the discipline-based, the communicational procedures, evidence and theory, quantitative written records, global verification, controlled experimentation to falsify hypothesis, skepticism, blah, blah, blah. And then on the other side, he put traditional native knowledge. Our traditional native knowledge is holistic. It includes physical and the metaphysical world linked to a moral code. It has emphasis on the practical application of skills and knowledge. It has trust for inherited wisdom, respect for all things, practical implementation, local verification, qualitative oral record, communication of metaphor and story connected to life, values, and proper behavior, integrated and applied to daily living and traditional subsistence practices. That's on the traditional native knowledge. But in between, where these two coalesce and touch each other, we do have common ground. And I want you to take faith and take hope that that common ground is something that we can work with and something that agroecologists can reach your hand out to those of us who are on the ground and grassroots and making those changes, and we can feel comfortable in reaching out to them. And that common ground is, we know that the universe is unified. We know that there is a body of knowledge stable but subject to modification. The habits of the minds, honesty, inquisitiveness, perseverance, open-mindedness, skills and procedures, pattern recognition, verification through repetition, empirical observation in natural settings, inference and prediction. We have common ground in knowledge. We know the plants, the animals, and the ecosystems, each in our own different way. We have knowledge of properties of objects and materials. We have knowledge of the position and the motion of objects. We have knowledge of the cycles, the connections, and changes in Earth's systems. So we do have common ground. So when I think about these things, and I think about the last few days, I've been taking notes. And I thought I would leave you with this, some of my additional thoughts. You got to remember, I'm not technologically competent, as my grandchildren say. So I asked this question. How does the research contribute to our tribes and our clans and our communities? How is the research going to help us to tell our stories? Is the data translated into a richness of flavor that empowers and reinforces the ownership by those who are researched? What is the gift and the legacy that we, along with the assistance and the help of the researchers, are going to be able to leave for future generations? So being here at this table, listening to all of you and watching all of you and questioning you has once again been able to rekindle in my heart and my mind that there is hope, that you guys, or at least a few of you, are going to be willing enough to join the war, because we are in the battle of our lives to make sure that humankind, the best of humankind, is able to survive this crisis that we are moving into. And we can leave a legacy and gifts for our children and our great-grandchildren and the future generations, so that they too can survive and have a healthy, happy, fulfilling life on this planet. Thank you.